want to really thank Stephen Hillier and the entire architecture school, all of you, for bringing the exhibition and these two structures to the school. I think really for all of us, it's a remarkable moment in the school, whether you've been here for a year or for a few decades. I think it's an important moment. I think the power of those structures, I was thinking the whole neighborhood is different with them out there. Just very quickly, I want to say, my relationship with John, the simple way to say is that I was a real lucky duck. I was just, incredibly lucky. I was a student here. I graduated in '91. And John asked me to stay and teach with him, and he gave me a space in the Hewitt building and to draw and to write. And I had about 10 years of continuous conversation, both teaching together and on our works, back and forth. And then I had the honor of being John's associate dean and then the acting dean. And I figured with this exhibition here and with these structures being built out front, I wanted to share some thoughts on John Hajduk. And so I prepared two talks. It's a part one and part two. The title of this talk is Hajduk, Hamlet, and the Ghost Promise. And the title of the talk on Thursday night, 6 o'clock here, is John Hajduk Through the Wall. And I thought as a way of introducing John, I wanted to begin with a short film clip. I'm going to be showing a few short film clips, and all of these, in fact, come from a film that Stephen put together when we had the memorial for John in 2000. So thank you again for that, Stephen. So.
A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to live in New York City, and I went into my garden, my backyard, and I always rake the leaves, get the leaves raked so that we could do some planting for the spring. And I have a neighbor next door, and he has a white fence. And as I was raking the leaves, a bear came around my neighbor's fence. And he was not a big bear, he was like a teenage bear. And I said, what am I going to do? And he was neither friendly nor unfriendly. He was just pushing his snoot into the leaves. And I was about 50 feet from my porch and my door. This, mind you, was in New York City. And he came over by my leg and sniffed. He wasn't mad, angry, he wasn't happy. I patted him. I said I should pat him. So I gave him a little pat. And then started to walk to the porch. And I said, I bet he will follow me. And he did follow me. And I finally got to the stair of my house. The stair goes to the porch, the outdoor porch. And I have a large hedge around the house, and he kept on sniffing. And just at that moment, that I said, if I have to run into the house, I don't think I'll make it, because he may get upset. And at that time, the postman, the mailman, we have a mailman who delivers the letters. Well, the mailman is coming around the hedge, and he's not a very good mailman. Most postmen are good mail because they deliver the mail. But my mailman is stupid because when it rains, he decides not to deliver the mail. But anyway, it wasn't raining, so he came around, and I saw him, and the bear was there. And I said, look, I have to go make a telephone call. Would you please watch him? And the mailman said, sure. And And when he said, sure, I climbed up the post onto my roof. And at that moment that I climbed up the post onto the roof, I realized that it was a dream. Because I can't climb up the post.
Okay, so that's a hint. I would say as difficult as it is to believe, every time John Hajduk spoke, he was that alive and that precise. So I want to begin with a quote from Jorge Luis Borges. Quote, "The fact is that every writer creates his own precursors. His work modifies our conception of the past as it will modify the future." End quote. John Hajduk's work has certainly modified our conception of the discipline of architecture, its past and its future. And today, I'm not going to try to explain him or sum him up. John Hajduk is far, far too large for that. A lifetime of creative exploration, probing, and constant invention cannot be addressed in these short talks. What I hope to do is draw a particular arc through John Hajduk's work that speaks to his deeply human and radically creative vision of architecture. A vision grounded in individual creativity as a profound social act, in the capacity of the personal imagination to construct shared spaces, and in the capacity of space itself to be literate, to embody the human condition, and in the capacity of the discipline of architecture to situate us in space, to inframe a social contract, and construct shelter and sanctuary for our mental, emotional, psychic, and spiritual lives, and physical lives. In other words, a vision grounded in architecture's life-sustaining dimensions. And this is a vision that I believe the full impact of which we have yet to witness. So as a means of moving towards this arc in the work of John Hajduk, I'd like to briefly address two ideas. The first, I would call the distance. Thinking about this, I've really been incredibly helped by the great work of Alberto Pérez Gómez, who you should all know. So for millennium, stories in the form of myths provided a means of navigating, a means of comprehending the world and our place within it. And some of the earliest of myths were shared through a form of embodied reenactment, right? Meaning a reenactment that was done with no audience. So all of the participants were within the myth. So you would become a dragon, you would become the sun, I would become the wind. Together we would reenact the myth and create this shared space of mutual telling between us. All of the participants were simultaneously tellers and listeners within the space of the story. And this shared space was immersed within the essential telling of nature itself. It existed as a kind of ship made of water. I sometimes think of the participants in this early form of reenactment as being within the myth and within the world at the same time. Around 2,500 years ago, the birth of Greek theater introduced a separation within this shared space. A separation between the reenactors and an audience, between the tellers and the listeners. This space is called the chora, and it's where the chorus is. I want to read a quote from Alberto Pérez Gómez. Quote, "Greek tragedy implicitly separated the orchestra or stage from the spectators in the amphitheater, signaling the transformation from a world of fully embodied participation in ritual, where human action was assumed to be at one with nature, to a world in which the spectator participated vicariously through vision and hearing." End quote. Now, a lot of things happen with that. One of the interesting things that happened is that there was a new form of participation through vision. Right? The landscape beyond the play, because the reenactment, audience, now the landscape beyond the play was pulled into the reenactment visually. Right? So the hills and meadows, sometimes it's actually the village where people lived, behind the stage commingled with the story. And in a way, they were understood as part of the myth. It was written onto the world. This commingled understanding was then carried within the participants as they re-entered the landscape. And what that did is it constructed a kind of literate geography, because as they move through their lives, they're also moving through that myth. It aligned the landscape of their lives with the landscape of their stories. Soon, scenery was introduced to the Greek theater. Surfaces were built and painted and placed at the back of the stage. These surfaces were there to reenact the landscape itself. So now you have a doubling of that. I imagine that the creators of the plays recognized this vertical flattening out, the perspective hinge, is what Alberto would call it, of the view beyond, and they began to construct these mimetic fragments of the landscape to allow further articulation and control of the story. In the simplest sense, they could now make it rain when it was sunny. This scenery constructed a second world that hovered within this distance, partially blocking and commingling with the view beyond. So this early separation of actor and audience is a critical moment in the development of Western civilization. As Alberto Pérez Gómez points out, quote, "This distance between actor and audience has marked Western civilization and continues to affect its science and art. It made reflective thought, authorship, and metaphysics possible, and coincided with the inception of alphabetic writing, or the objectification of speech." So, building a world that partially blocks the world and can be rearticulated as a mode of exchange with the world is linked to the origins of Western art, architecture, science, and technology. Looking out through the play transformed the within of previous reenactments, and it created a new form of participation, a new mode of authorship and constructing and navigating these literate spaces of our stories. So this speaks to space itself, not as a neutral field out there, but as an assembled coherence. It's constructed. It's not only within us or the exterior world, but it's in fact between the world and our experience of it. So our senses are constantly moving about, all of our perception, sensory perception, and this layering and it's assembling this coherent whole of this space. And these rapidly shifting set of perceptions, they're calibrated and they're assembled and they're recalibrated. And there's this continuous present tense structuring of our space and time. And through this very deep cognitive process, we are building this room. Right? We build the room. Now, much of this is, of course, structured in our evolution as a species. Right? You could say that our eyes are next to each other because we've been looking at the horizon for millions of years. Little parentheses, I said that to Monica once, and without missing a beat, she said, "Are you sure it's not the reverse?" You have to think about that for a second. Maybe we've been looking for millions of years because our eyes are next to each other. I love Monica Shapiro. So, much of it is evolutionary, but our evolutionary time frame, our development as a species, is not the only participant in the constant construction of our experience of the world. The experience of this room is, yes, of course, linked to cognition and sensory perception, but is also inseparable from the capacity of memory, the personal imagination, to situate us in space and time. Our memory, imagination, thoughts, language, stories, knowledge, hopes, fears, desires, they all participate in the structuring of our spatial temporal experience. And this is a fundamental exchange with the world, and it's of course reciprocal. Absorbing and projecting in both directions, meaning as we build the room builds us. As we construct space, they construct us, meaning they're filling us with their structure, their content, and their character, and their spirit. And this reciprocal filling or co-constructing of experience speaks to the very elemental and I would say profoundly human condition of being a body. We are a body. We have a body, but we are a body. Meaning, we are a breathing organ, memory, perception, cognition. We're a body that has a great propensity to say, I have a body, meaning my leg hurts, my leg hurts, I take possession of it, my voice is getting tired. We're constantly taking possession of our body through language. And this organic breathing in and out of words. So the body we are and the body we have are in a way either conspiring, you can say, with this external environment to construct a literate space or a spatial literacy that's commingling, right? Kind of opening or clearing in space and time. This enfolding of our perception, our language, and our memory speaks to another idea that I'd like to briefly touch on. It comes from a wonderful man named J. Fellows, who taught here at Cooper in the School of Architecture for many years, and he had a profound influence on John Hejduk. Jay wrote a book, and it was called The Failing Distance. And he was writing about autobiographical space. The autobiographical impulse in Ruskin, in fact. So, very briefly, the relationship between writing and space. Jay developed a relationship between optical vision and literary point of view, as in first-person point of view, or third-person, omniscient view, plan, perspective, all of these linkages between authorship and space. He speaks of writing as a link between the focal point and the station point. Between the singular station point of first-person voice and the multiple perspectives of a kind of omniscient view. And Jay describes the act of writing in autobiographic space as a kind of claustrophobia spatially. Writing about you when you were young. Right? That creates a space, a distance, right? Between the present self and this old self. Now, if you move closer to the present, say write about you 10 years ago, the space starts to foreshorten. The focal point of your past moves closer to the picture plane of your present. Write about last year. The previous year moves towards you. The space begins to compress. Last month, last week, now write about yesterday, and then, of course, today. Write autobiographically about 20 minutes ago as you walked into the room. And then write right now. Right now. In that moment, we speak. We begin to speak. We speak ourselves. Our breath is commingling with our language, and the distance collapses and we have voice. And through this collapsed, failing distance, our present tense speaks us into space, constructing a literate inhabitation. So the collapsed folding in of present tense and the pushing back to see from a distance are really inseparable from our situation in the world. And with these two understandings of viewing through the distance and the collapse of the failing distance, I'd like to look at a particular art in the work of John Hajduk, and I would like to begin with a quote. It's his entire introduction to the book Soundings, which he dedicated to J. Fellows. Quote, "If one gyrates, rotates ellipses with sufficient energies, they become a straight line, moving from space to space, from time to time. The original curvature is unseen, but nonetheless felt." End quote. I want to begin in Texas. For about 10 years, John Hajduk worked on a series of houses called the Texas houses. He began them while he was teaching in Texas in 1953, and he continued to work on them until 1963. They were a very focused study of Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Palladio, as well as, of course, John's own creative interests. And they were essentially square in plan. And one day I was sitting with John looking at the Texas House drawings, and he pointed out something to me that I think is an essential first fact. He pointed out that this wall of I-beams in the middle, and he said that the middle member of those I-beams is made of glass. He said that way you can see through the wall instead of through the wall. Okay, that's Texas. Next step. From 1963 to 1967, John Hejduk worked on what he called the diamond houses. He took the square plan, and he read it in axonometric. So it rotated into a diamond. Very complex issue of the two-dimensional and three-dimensional in that. Because it was two-dimensional, it turned. Here John was studying Mondrian, Theo van Doesburg, and of course he was in close dialogue with the painter Robert Slutsky, who taught here. And this led to a 1967 exhibition called The Diamond in Painting and Architecture. So through a series of realizations about vision and space and geometry, John began to flatten out the sides of the diamond and focus on the hypotenuse. So very, very briefly, one of the ideas was, it has to do with center focus and peripheral vision, like all of this out here. And if you are in here and you're looking at that point, these sides, because of how peripheral vision works, start to flatten out. Now, if you're out here looking at this, these sides start to flatten out this way. Okay? And this is a quote from John. Quote, "The conclusion permits the thesis of maximum extension from maximum compression. That of seeing perpendicular to the observer's vision. That of seeing laterally the hypotenuse, which is, of course, seen through the wall." So, he began to study this diamond and its hypotenuse in multiple readings. The corners as focal points and station points, the hypotenuse as a picture plane, the possibility of inverting the focal points and station points, the possibility of thinking of the corners temporally as futures and pasts, the picture plane as the present, hypotenuse as the present, pulling together pasts and presents at the corners, and then the biomorphic conditions of life moving back and forth, right, through the picture plane of the present, moving back and forth, remembering the past, anticipating the future. And in these inverse perspectives, these pushings and pullings of time and space, distances and failing distances, John Hejduk discovered the wall house, a collapse of time into space, an inhabitation of the hypotenuse, seen through the wall. Here, the present is made solid, structurally holding up life, holding up the past compressive spaces of memory and the anticipatory spaces of the future. Think of the present tense assembly, or think of J. Fellows and the claustrophobia. Here's a quote from John. Quote, "I felt the necessity that the wall be freestanding, acting as a tableau upon which the biomorphic elements should be suspended. The wall also emerged in plan from the diamond plan diagrams. That is, the hypotenuse of the diamond became the wall in plan. One could erase the peripheral vestiges of the diamond outline. Wall House 1 was a new discovery." And in fact, here is a sketch where John actually shows this maximum compression leading from diamond to the wall. This is a quote from John again. Quote, "I poured all of the multiple meanings I could into this small structure. It was a direct confrontation and challenge to a society that in architecture only celebrated the third dimension. In a way, ironically, this house had to do with the idea of the present, the celebration of the two-dimensional. It was leading and condensing to a point. It had to do with time." End quote. This was Wall House 2, also known as the By House. Many people don't know why it's called the By House. It's called the By House because a man named Edwin By taught here. He was a landscape architect who had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. He used to bring a box of dirt and some sticks. He poured dirt on this table and he would teach us landscape architecture by moving it around. It was incredible. And Edwin By was going to build this house in Connecticut, and then through all kinds of stories, it was built in Groningen in 2000, seen through the wall. Now, each of the living spaces, there's a wall, there's a stair tower on this side. In order to move between the living spaces, you have to pass back and forth through the wall. If you put the diamond with that as the hypotenuse, there's only one space that's outside of the diamond. That's the studio. That's the one viewing it from outside. It had to do with time. John Hajduk did his first wall house in 1971. And he continued to do them throughout his life, in many, many ways. And I believe that this new discovery of the wall house served as his gate. That the initial early impulse to see through the wall instead of through the wall moved through the diamond to the wall house and to the discovery of a previously unknown spaces. These realignments of time and space, of vision and structure, of geometry, memory, and language sparked a transformation in John Hajduk and in the discipline of architecture. As Charles Olson said of Herman Melville, he pushed time so far back that he found space. And I believe with the wall house, John Hajduk did just that. The solid space of that wall, of that present tense, is no metaphor. As one moves back and forth across the wall, they are captured in a still stop of the present. And that instant of stillness can be elongated out into time. It can be inhabited. With the wall house, John Hajduk found the still life that inhabits life. He could now still stop time as a means of inhabiting and articulating space. It was as if the invention of photography occurred within his body. He could now do that. He could now experience the sensation of time in a continuous present and creatively work with this elongated still-stop condition, capturing the stillness and moving elements, authoring this silent space in frozen time. This is John Hajduk talking about the words still life, or nature morte, dead nature. Quote, "We seldom look at the real meanings of certain pairings of words. If we did, they might still stop us." Also, if a painter could, by a single transformation, take a three-dimensional still life and paint it on a canvas into a nature morte, Could it be possible for the architect to take the nature morte of a painting and by a single transformation build it into a still life? And this is a more extended quote of John talking about photography. Quote, "The first time I entered the imagination of Adolf Loos, while I was looking at a photograph, a still photo of an interior that Loos created. It was a room filled with marble walls, pilasters, and columns. The overall effect on me was that through the photo, I had entered the inner thought of Loos. The veins within the marble were a multitude of lightning flashes in the dark sky. The surface of the electrifying photo was transferred to the surface of my eyes, and then to the inner spaces of my enclosed brain. In a split moment, the room which contained an architectural soul through the veins of marble was offered as a gift. A three-dimensional room was two-dimensionalized into a flat surface of photographic paper, which then penetrated my transparent eyes, which act as a veil, then to be printed into the folds of my mind, as a matter of fact, into the crevices, which in a second could will up the image, will up to thought, will up to solidity of thought. Adolf Loos had shown me, if only a glimpse, the soul of marble. A sacred transference of solid space occurred." End quote. The plan of a photograph is a straight line. The plan of a photograph is a straight line. I've always loved this sentence. Why? Because it sounds like a sentence, but it really quickly grows a question mark at the end. Right? The plan of a photograph is a straight line. It immediately creates a situation, a circular, perhaps paradoxical, and I would say human knot. The plan of a photograph is, in fact, a straight line. If we accept a photograph's reality, its material reality, to be that of a piece of paper. Piece of paper. Draw a plan, you get a straight line. But of course, this denies the photograph. It denies the spatial and temporal depth, the perceptual recognition and memory that are, in fact, the experiential structure of a photograph. The plan of a photograph cannot be a straight line. And this is the contrafactual condition upon which both a plan and a photograph exist. The experiential structure of both a plan and a photograph contain space and language, representation, artifice. A plan and a photograph both contain a spatial literacy. They both have the potential to be inhabited. The construction of a plan of a photograph demands us to take a stand. Go to draw that plan. You have to take a stand. You have to construct a depth. You can't deny the photo. It's not only material. You have to create a depth. You have to creatively operate within the present, and you have to push back the line to understand that distance. This act of pushing back the line, of opening up literate spaces of inhabitation within the present, is fundamental to our human condition. And we can see the spaces of the wall house as a kind of pushing back, a kind of biological poesis, you could say, or a life hydraulics, right? Pushing back the line, opening them up. Breathing open spaces of the biomorphic conditions of memory and imagination and body and spirit. Following the wall house, these literate spaces are deep within the plan, deep within architecture, and they're deep within John Hajduk. He could now will them up to solidity of thought. And I believe that with the wall house, John Hajduk absorbed the capacity to still stop time as a form of embodied knowledge. He absorbed it like a musician does their instrument, right? The way a musician knows how to play their instrument. John Hajduk, in a way, he went through the mirror, and he took architecture with him. And in passing this limit, The rearticulated linkages of time and space were not limited to the representation of space. All space was transformed for John Hejduk, and this included social, political space. From Texas to the Diamond to the Wall House, these early works contain the seeds of a point of view, of a worldview, that ultimately led to a radically different understanding of architecture and its social contracts. And much of the work that followed the Wall House was manifest as a continuous work John Hejduk called the social contract. Multiple structures constructed in different parts of the world beginning in 1984, all finding their root, structure, and program in the social, political, and literary and spatial mysteries of the human condition. I want to play a clip of John talking about these.
And what I did is built a repertoire of, say, 400 pieces, or 400 characters, however you want to say. And I've done that over 15 years, right? And now what's happening is that in different places throughout the world, they are building each of these characters. So there's basically no client, fundamentally. They draw it up, they detail it, they are part of the creation of the thing, and then they put it out into the public domain, and it becomes some kind of strange celebration of the art of building, of the art of structure, of the social, political aspect of architecture, which seems to have disappeared.
This is the collapse of time. I find it significant. The first such structure to be built was called the Collapse of Time. It was built in London at the Architectural Association in 1986. This is security in Oslo, Norway, sited to face the building used by the SS during the occupation. Each piece addresses the social political aspect of a particular program, place, and people. Each were built by communities as a social act, a celebration of the individual and collective imagination, a celebration of the spaces within us and between us. This is the house of a poet built in Barcelona, in Spain. Each structure was built as both a reenactment and a present tense action. All of the participants were simultaneously tellers and listeners, creating structures, creating a shared space of the social contract. This is the Mask of Medusa, built in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And it was used for theatrical performances. The structures were then placed out into the public domain, re-entering the landscape, constructing a new form of literate geography, aligning the landscape of the architectural programs with the landscape of their sites, creating a new form of participation, a new mode of constructing coherence. This is Object-Subject. It was built in Philadelphia at the University of the Arts, also used in performances. This is the mobile housing unit. It's built in Milan, Italy. This is the Card Tower and Joker, built in Groningen, the Netherlands, where the Wall House 2 was built in 2000. This is the Conciliator, built in New York City. This is the house for a musician, a house for a painter, built in Berlin, Germany. I'm going to play another film.
It was almost medieval, that the creation of structures, where I just made a little sketch, and they always say the architect has to follow everything and he has to be such an understanding person, so bright and things like that. And each country built it. They built it creatively in their method. And I had only one requirement. I said, look, you want to do this? All I require is that the spirit is captured.
This is the house of the suicide and the house of the mother of suicide. Built first in Atlanta, Georgia, and then in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and now in New York City, here at the Cooper Union. 31 years ago, the AA built the first piece, and now here we are. We have them right in front of the building. It's kind of an incredible view. So I want to look in detail at how these two architectures came into being as a mode of understanding the social contract works. On January 16th, 1969, Jan Palach, a 20-year-old student in Prague, self-immolated. He went to Winchester Square and lit himself ablaze in protest of the 1968 Soviet Union invasion of Czechoslovakia. This invasion and subsequent occupation crushed the Prague Spring, a spirited, artistic, cultural, and political movement. His death became a powerful symbol of the resistance to the totalitarian communist rule. In 1971, poet David Shapiro, John Hejduk's dear friend, who was here at the opening the other night, wrote a poem entitled The Funeral of Jan Palach.
Here's the poem that I wrote. When I entered the first meditation, I escaped the gravity of the object. I experienced the emptiness, and I have been dead a long time. When I had a voice, you could call a voice. My mother wept to me, my son, my beloved son. I never thought this possible. I'll follow you on foot. Halfway in mud and slush, the microphones picked up. It was raining on the houses. It was snowing on the police cars. The astronauts were weeping, going either up or out. And my own mother was great enough. She wept. And it was all right. I was dead.
John Hajduk, deeply moved by this poem, accepted it as an architectural program for which he created the House of the Suicide and the House of the Mother of Suicide. In 1986, these two works were constructed in Atlanta, Georgia, by a group of people, students and teachers, led by Professor Jim Williamson. In 1989, Václav Havel, playwright, poet, and political prisoner, led the Velvet Revolution, which brought about the end of totalitarian communist rule in Czechoslovakia. This being one of the very few non-violent revolutions of the 20th century. That same year, Václav Havel became the president of Czechoslovakia. In a matter of 13 weeks, he went from political prisoner to president. And he had no intention of being president. A quote from my dear friend, Farid Moslahi, Quote, "In moments of existential crisis, time has a tendency to collapse. Whole chains of events that may usually require years and decades to unfold suddenly happen overnight." End quote. Known as the poet president, Havel recognized the significance of the house of the suicide and the house of the mother of the suicide and requested that they be built in front of his presidential offices. This is Václav Havel, John, and David. Grounded in the sorrow of a mother's loss, this architectural act is prefigured by the departure of the life within. Accepting Jan Pollock's act and David Shapiro's poem as the program of an architecture captures the abandonment and the collapse of a people's freedom. The house of the suicide and the house of the mother of suicide construct an inverse perspective from which to address this loss. The empathy of an individual loss clears a space for the memory of the many lost to that time. Václav Havel understood this. As visitors passed through the gate and moved across the yard to his office toward the challenges of the present, their present, and the rearticulations of their future, they view and are viewed by a ghost of the recent past. Time collapses into space as they silently address their own inner memory of loss, contained within the broad memory of a collective collapse into tyranny. Told and retold, in 2002, they were constructed at the Whitney Museum as part of the Sanctuaries exhibition. Last year, the two pieces were constructed in steel and aluminum and installed permanently in Jan Pollock Square, Prague. And now, today they stand with us at the Cooper Union. As this school and this nation face the challenges of our past and present and future. Quote, "Individual creativity within a willing community is a profound social act." End quote. The work establishes the personal imagination and individual actions, Jan Pollock's, David Shapiro's, John Hajduk's, as a crucial element of our shared stories and spaces. The poetic imagination, through spatial literacy, offered the most precise means of comprehending that loss and acting within that. The spaces created by the house of the suicide and the house of the mother of suicide speak to us. They speak to our humanity. But, and I think it's an important but, they speak in silence. How can these spaces be literate when space speaks silence? How do we speak of space when space speaks silence? How do we author silence? Perhaps if space speaks silence, we too contain a silence deep within us. A silence which is not the denial of language or of time or history, but the void which at once is prefiguring, circumscribing, and moving through us. Could it be that space contains a silence that speaks to a silence contained within us? The silence of space does not diminish the capacity of space to be literate. It moves in, it communicates to our interior thought, it informs our internal literacy, both situating the individual imagination and constructing connective tissues between all of us. Between us and our works, between us and each other, between us and all time. Space is a participant in our thoughts and actions. Perhaps space is the other half of us, completing us, and constructing the spaces that bind together our humanity. And this is where spatial literacy becomes spatial literature. That's architecture. Offering an experiential depth to our social political and social poetic lives. Don't worry, I know you told me you have to go. The social contract is a form of participation and contribution among our fellow citizens. But it is also a contract with space itself as the other half of us. A contract to embody the widest, most nuanced spectrum of what it is to be human into our reciprocal spaces. In this sense, architecture is a life-sustaining discipline, an empathetic discipline with a life of its own, reciprocal to ours. The poet Anne Carson says, quote, "For a poet's despair is not just personal, he despairs of the word, and that implicates all of our hopes." End quote. In 1599, the year before Hamlet was performed, Shakespeare and his company decided to move the Globe Theatre to Bankside. It's a location on the other side of the Thames River. They quite literally moved the theatre. They dismantled the Globe piece by piece and carried the entire structure across the river and reassembled it. The Globe Theatre was no small structure. It was a 3-story circular edifice that held an audience of 3,000 people. The very next season, the company performed Hamlet. And it is quite likely that this Herculean task of moving the globe occurred as Shakespeare was writing the play. That Shakespeare felt the weight of the roof beams in his forearms as he held his pen and crafted Hamlet. And this can be heard when Hamlet says, "Do the boys carry it away?" And Rosencrantz responds, "Ah, that they do, my lord, Hercules and his load too." Throughout the play, Hamlet continues to speak of his cognition of himself as a construction of language. Continues to acknowledge that he has been written into existence in a play about playing. Hamlet at times addresses the audience and directly taunts Shakespeare himself. Because during the 1601 season, Shakespeare himself played the ghost. This is from Harold Bloom. Incredible book called Hamlet, Poem Unlimited. Quote, "The ghost exits murmuring, 'Remember me,' and we hear Hamlet reminding the Globe audience that he, Shakespeare, is one of them. 'Thou poor ghost, whilst memory holds a seat in this distracted globe.' You're both, and everybody here knows that." The audience, end quote, the audience, well aware of the double role of Shakespeare as author and actor, as well as the fact that the theater in which all of Shakespeare's plays was performed was named the Globe, must have acutely felt their own predicament, their own double role. They had been pulled into the play by Hamlet. This correspondence between the pen and the roof beams, between the language of the theater and the edifice of the theater, is a crucial knot in the mystery of language and space. Shakespeare's act of dismantling and reconstructing the Globe Theatre contributed to Hamlet's act of dismantling and reconstructing the structure of theater. It certainly prefigured it. Here, we have an architectural act prefiguring and contributing to a literary act. We have the roof held up by the life within. And this raising of the roof beams may also have been grounded in the memory of loss and sensation of collapse. On August 11th, 1596, a few short years prior to writing Hamlet and moving the Globe, Shakespeare lost his 11-year-old son named Hamlet. In writing himself into the role of the ghost, speaking with his son in the world of the living, Shakespeare constructed an inverse perspective from which to address his loss. It was a literary act grounded in the empathy of a father's longing. I believe Shakespeare carried the structure of the Globe Theatre and the language of Hamlet because he needed their space. For it is in space, and only in space, that Shakespeare could inhabit himself, inhabit the odd symmetry between raising the roof beams and raising the ghost. See, a ghost, by definition, our definition of ghost, is that they inhabit two worlds at the same time. They must be and remain from the beyond while becoming present in the sphere of life. It's like an eclipse. An eclipse, the presence of one sphere, takes the form of a shadow on another sphere. The promise of this double condition of an eclipse lies in the capacity of making the ineffable present, to manifest the shadow of one world into another world. Ultimately, Hamlet did escape the temporal confines of the Globe Theatre, because as a construction of language, his character is being reenacted somewhere on Earth at every given moment, at every given instant. Hamlet is given voice, told and retold. Hamlet exists in a continuous present. He is always telling. He lives in a state of suspended time. So Hamlet's continuous telling is Hamlet's continuous resurrection. It's not that Hamlet, Shakespeare, will rise or has risen. He is rising. He's always rising. So both Hamlet and Hajduk construct inverse perspectives from which to address the empathy of loss. Through language, space, structure, and memory, the shadows of Hamlet, Shakespeare, and John Pollock are made present in the sphere of life. The strength of their fragility are cast into the lived spaces of our shared stories, making the ineffable present as part of our connective tissue. And holding a seat in this, our distracted globe, the literary dimensions of life and the precisions of the poetic imagination offer an inverse perspective from which to address our loss, from which to imagine a just globe. They introduce a politics of slowing down, of searching for new modes of concern for the other, new spaces of empathy and ethics, new stories to rebind freedom. The social contract works of John Hajduk are a continuous shining moment within the discipline of architecture. His work modifies our conception of the past as it will modify the future. And I want to show two films.
I'm a product of 1908 to 30. That's my time. I can't help it. I was born in 1929. And I don't go over into past 1938. There are no generations could go from 38 to 68 or 68 to 98. There's two more generations after mine. That's the excitement. Each generation has its structure. And I gave you my structure. You want the other structure? You have to ask that. But their structure, there's two more generations after me. I'm alive and kicking. That's the modern movement. That's the modern movement. I enjoy youth because, not that I'm like Dracula, you know, that I can feed off their youth, but I do. They feed off my age and I feed off their youth. It's a marvelous relationship that goes on. But on the other hand, they are the speculative future. I'm the speculative past. They're the speculative future. Fantastic.
So that's all of us, that's you. And I want to end on a few brief observations about the speculative future. In creating an architecture of such great force, such intensity and originality, such depth and scope, I believe that John Hajduk authored the discipline of architecture. As Shakespeare dismantled and reconstructed the structure of theater, John Hajduk transformed the very structure of the discipline of architecture. John Hajduk spent his life working toward and instinctively and intimately knowing that the discipline of architecture contains something deeply mysterious and deeply human. John Hajduk gave us his structure, and with it the seeds of an eclipse within the structure of the discipline of architecture, the seeds of a new form of practice, a new form of school, a form recognizing that architecture is a life-sustaining discipline with the capacity to hold up our lives. So unique, so other, that accepting the enormous gift of John Hajduk's work, of his structure, is itself a creative work, an exploratory work of the personal imagination, of investigation, of intense study, a work demanding risk and precision and honesty and gentleness and courage. A loving work of quite literally creating architecture's speculative futures, our speculative futures. I want to share something that I think is important.
I, for one, have been blessed with a moment in education where I have had a social contract. And many of the people sitting today in this audience have made my life more understandable because of their understanding of the social contract.
So this speaks to perhaps what for John Hajduk was the most essential social contract. The program that he worked on and in his entire life, the program of school. He gave us his structure, starting with the foundation, free speech, the Great Hall. Holding up the library, cultural memory housed in books, holding up the exhibition of works, holding up the third story, the two-dimensional world of architecture, and the fifth story, the two-dimensional world of art, meeting in the fourth story, the wood and metal shop, opening the three-dimensional world of substance. The educational program and the architectural program are inside of each other, holding each other up, structurally supporting each other. A model of education, built in direct conversation with Peter Cooper's vision, a humanist cultural vision, a humanist cultural project of removing barriers and transforming knowledge and society through individual creativity within a willing community. To paraphrase and recombine a bit, Charles Olson, great poet and the last director of Black Mountain College, this complex of occasions is no income of novel abstract form. End quote. This model of free education embraces and it amplifies free thought, exploratory thought, independent thought. This is a quote from John Hajduk. Quote, "I believe in the social contract, therefore I teach. I believe that the university is one of the last places that protects and preserves freedom. Therefore, teaching is also a social political act, among other things. I believe in books and the written word. Therefore, I fabricate works with the hope that they will be recorded in books. I am pragmatic and believe in keeping records. I believe to record is to bear witness. The book I wrote, Victims, is to bear witness and to remember. I believe in the density of the sparse. I believe in place and the spirit of place. I read, I teach, I draw, I construct, I initiate structures, I fabricate poems, I think. I celebrate the discipline I am within. There is the possibility of a vision of architecture that might be interpreted as a fabrication. During its construction, it disappears. It clarifies as it uncovers. It reveals as it erodes. It celebrates as it captures. It pronounces as it closes. It crosses over. The method is severe. Architecture is filtered through the parallel disciplines of painting, literature, and medicine. It is an elliptical method, and it is incremental. It is unrelenting. End quote. It is incremental. It is unrelenting. Schools sheltered the promise to manifest material, spatial, and social contracts. And in its most fundamental sense, school is not a means to any predetermined end or any instrumental future. School is a community. It's a place for exploration, exploratory works, actions, and gestures. An incremental, unrelenting place for slowing down. A place where the life of the works reflect the life of the school. And where the depth of the works reflect the depth of the school. Where the ethical dimension of the works reflect the ethical dimension of the school, emanating the widest spectrum of who we are, of our humanity, making our lives more understandable. And architecture, in its unrelenting search for us, is evolving in unpredictable and unimagined ways. And perhaps the 21st century will witness an entirely new architecture. A new social contract, a new polis, with their roots in the works and teachings of Peter Cooper and John Hager. Thank you. So thank you for coming. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to respond. I will say, Thursday night I'm going to do another talk, and I'll talk about that then. But I needed to this time because that where this goes is another world, and. The other day when I was finalizing the second one, and I realized, Stephen does this as well as anyone, even both together, and believe me, I think they're good talks. I realized it's like 15% of John's work. I mean, I could do like 7 and maybe get to like 40% because it's endless. There's so much work. I don't know anybody even came close to creating that much work. So you're going between this and the other one is a really good scope. But as doing it, I was like, I can do another. It's wild. So anyway, yeah.
Hi. Thank you. It's really good.
Thanks for coming.
There's a lot of stuff that I can touch on that I found really insightful. The analogy at the beginning, that space that's created between the backdrop and the actor and the audience. As we partially block the world, there's something there. And I'm curious about that, almost like the breakthrough in the Texas house to the wall house, the whole idea of time, where these pieces were then able to evolve, or these that don't position themselves anywhere, so they almost became timeless. So can you expand a little bit more about that breakthrough for Hajduk himself, where as he constructed this space, he's constructed behind this space, and then all of these timeless structures evolved out of that. If you could touch upon that.
Sure. I mean, there's probably 7, 8, 10 angles of incidence to this exact issue. And you really made it beautifully complex by linking the problematic of time, still-stop time, relationship between, embodied knowledge of time, and then linking that to the social contract works, which of course is this issue of singular and multiple, right? There's the house of the suicide and the mother of suicide, and then there's multiple voices of it. Right? Very, very interesting to think about that relative to Hamlet. I mean, whoever is Hamlet is Hamlet. The thing about the diamond house becoming the wall house, the reason I focus on that so much to get to these, it's a very complex thing. It really has to do with let me back up a second. It has to do with the body and language. This great giant mystery, right? I do probably 3 talks on that in my seminar for a reason. And the impact that our language has on our sensation of everything, including time. Temporality, time is the sensation of time. In fact, that's all it is. Right? And that sensation can be elongated, can be stretched. Right? Think about an hour-and-a-half film. Think of a 4-hour film. Think of a 10-hour film. Right? There's a sensation of temporality. It could be excruciating, or Jonas Smikas made a 24-hour film. Now, he obviously it was a portrait of Raymond Abraham. He obviously cued it to 24 hours for a reason, right? He's saying we actually, in a way, can imagine that we're living inside of film, right? So that elongation of time, and partially some of the syntactical, geometric moves John was making, really between Texas and Diamond, where he discovered what some people today call the Heydukian axonometric, which is a 90-degree axonometric, right? You probably have seen me draw. I don't know if I have chalk. If you take a square and then you make it a double square, right? So that could be 2 squares, or it could be a cube in axonometric, where that's the top and that's the front. If it's a 90-degree axonometric, so it's 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional at the same time, right? It's always both. That doubleness is very important to understand language and space, and it was in those moves. It was very important, meaning John inhabited those questions, and that's what led to, once the hypotenuse was present, and it became solid. The wall house. It became thick. There was a transformation that he and I spoke about, where you get entangled in that. The end of the next talk, I'm going to talk about entanglement, and that had to do with a wrestling match between Brock's paintings and John, and this sense of entanglement that were going on in those paintings. Take that, much further. You get to Brock. You get to, And one other thing I want to throw in, it's a little hard for me to do quick. It's something I usually spend an hour on in my seminar, but I'm going to do a super sliver version of it. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. This double, the fact that it's flat, it's 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional. The minute you say it's an axonometric, right? It's a little bit like the plan of the photograph bar. That is not only out there. It's part of life. It's part of the human condition. And the example I often give, we understand embodied knowledge, where do you know how to play the violin, right? So you know it in your body. You can't talk your way into playing the violin, right? You have to play the violin. So your arms, your hands, your breath, your ears, everything is in this conversation. And so then you can say, so where's the knowledge of the violin, right? It's a classic play on how do we know what we know. We say, where do we know what we know? When you work with that for a long time, we spend a day on that question, we get to a really fascinating problem, which is speech. Because if you just apologize in advance, picture my tongue right now, all the infinite little movements it's doing to do this, to make these sounds, right? I have no idea how I do that. But I have a really good idea of it. I'm really good at it. I do it all the time. So there's a double I. There's me, who has an embodied knowledge of language, of speech. So my breath mixes with language and becomes voice, it becomes speech. That double I, the one who has no idea how this happens, the one who's voicing it away, right? Bob Marley, not me, Bob Marley, where voice becomes some vibration. That is linked to this double. To the fact that it's two-dimensional and three-dimensional are have a vibration, meaning drawings also have a double I. It's substance, it's chalk. And it becomes language. It doesn't give up its chalk, it has a body. The drawing can be of something, it is something. Always both. Okay? So that's as short as I can do. Sorry, it's obviously a broad subject. Getting inside of that far enough, John developed the ability to inhabit still life, to perceive the motion against the stillness, right? The stillness of that drawing, let's say. And part of the idea, the collapse of time, that first piece of it as well, part of it is very simple in a way. I mean, it's obviously not, but architecture, think how still it is. Right? This building has been in framing through its stillness. It's here for 150 years. It's been an invitation to all the movement that happens in it. So this is partially why, and it's a very simple and beautiful expression of why John was so interested in the still life. Because of its deep links to architecture, to the role that architecture plays in our lived lives. That's part of how it inframes our stories, is through its stillness. I hope that helped. Okay, so just if anybody wants to look ahead, I'm not going to tell you everything I'm going to do Thursday, but we're going to look at victims, which is a very, very important project that John Hajduk did. And we're going to look at the sanctuaries drawings, which are really the last drawings of John Hajduk, the little yellow book sanctuaries. Okay? Great. Nice to see you all. Thanks for coming.